Many say that it is the most prestigious racing series in the world, and while that may be contestable, it is uncontestable that these are the fastest, most track-focused cars on the planet. Formula 1. We got 100 years history to cover. This may be a while. You've been warned. We have to start at the very beginning of auto racing in 1906 under the title Grandes Expreses, or Grand Prix for us Americans. And this was a very good racing series until World War I happened. But don't worry, by the mid-1920s, they deemed Europe intact enough to, go racing again. And once again, the racing was pretty good until World War II. And by 1946, Europe was deemed intact enough to resume racing, headed by a new governing body called the Commission Sportive Internationale, or CSI. This was a section of the FIA which created Formula C, Formula B, and Formula A. Now after a little while, they became Formulas 3, 2, and the top tier, 1. And the first GP was held in Turin, Italy in 1946. It was won by a Chile Vazarzi in an Alfa Romeo 158. And it turns out that was a pretty good car to choose, because the pre-war 158 was a power monster, 420 horsepower from a 1.5-liter supercharged engine. And it was pretty cheap because it was, before World War II. Argentinian driver named Juan Manuel Fangio won every single race but one in 1949 and took the driver's title, which was recently introduced, by the way, after the motorcycle racing and FIA started introducing the same thing. He took that title outright in 1951. There was a downside with the 158, however. It got a whopping 1.3 miles to the gallon. We are approaching gallons per mile territory here in an unironic sense. That means you gotta carry almost all of that fuel with you. There were 250-liter endurance fuel tanks fitted to these cars for just a few hours of racing. It was horrible on the MPG department, and you had to lug all that weight around you as you go around the course. And this Italian engineer named Enzo Ferrari, who had raced the 158 before, realized that these ancient supercharged engines were just too inefficient and their days were numbered. So, he chose the much more fuel-efficient option of a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated V12. You never say that about a naturally aspirated V12 these days. But it worked. The engine got 7 times the MPG as the Alfa. And then, well, it didn't really matter because Alfa Romeo withdrew because of finances. And, BRM was not exactly reliable, and the privateers had no money. So these Ferrari guys, who had money, knew what they were doing, and had a very fast car, dominated everything, clinching the driver's title 3 years in a row. And the FIA, strangely, didn't like Ferrari doing that. Weird thing to say these days, but it was true back then. They decided to quell these dominant Ferraris with a new 2.5-liter engine regulations. And you know what? It worked. For the introduction in 1954, this led to Lancia entering the D50, and Maserati entering the 250F, where Fangio won his 5th straight championship, in a record that would stand for over 45 years. There was another thing, though. These Italians thought they knew what they were doing, okay? They had this sort of smug attitude to them that they were the kings of Grand Prix, which, to be fair, was true for quite a while. However, when you don't have any money, how do you win? You innovate. And that's where the British come in. You see, since the races were no longer pure endurance races, they were shortened to just 300 miles. And this guy named John Cooper, in his shed in Surrey, England, decided, hey, what if we put the engine in the middle? The result was the Cooper Climax F1, the world's first mid-engine Grand Prix racer. And once you know it, the mid-engine Grand Prix car, designed in a shed, absolutely trounced the big dogs in Italy. The garagistas, as Enzo called them, were shattering all Grand Prix records, winning both championships in 1959 and 1960. It quite literally rewrote the rulebook, and while good old Enzo never admitted he was wrong, he coincidentally designed a mid-engine car for 1961. John Cooper, well, he was just a start, because a British engineer slash team owner by the name of Colin Chapman had taken his already successful Formula Junior team, Lotus, and brought them up to the big leagues in 1961, and got their first win with a guy named Sterling Moss. He's a pretty good driver, you might have heard of him. He's an absolute legend. And speaking of legends, Colin Chapman and his team Lotus would go on to pioneer more innovative tech than any other motorsport known to man for the next 30 years. Things like the monocoque chassis, stress member engines, a Cosworth DFV, inboard brakes, torsion bar suspension, aerodynamic wings, ground effect, twin chassis carbon fiber, and most importantly of all, the Lotus 49. This was the car that introduced the DFV engine. It introduced stress member engines, and critically, to all motorsport, not just F1, it introduced sponsorship. The red, white, and gold Lotus 49 was basically the first billboard on wheels. And like it or not, this quite literally changed motorsport forever. More so than any other innovation, arguably in history. But there was a price with all of this groundbreaking innovation. As speeds increased, thanks to the more powerful engines, the mid-engine layout, the monocoque chassis, all that stuff, the track safety didn't. Deaths became a common occurrence, unfortunately. If you raced 5 years in Formula 1, there was a 75% chance you would die behind the wheel. 75%! In 1961, in one race alone at Monza, Wolfgang von Trips and 14 other spectators died in a crash. And just 3 years before that, 7 drivers were killed. And in the 3 years after that, another 3 were killed. F1 would not have a fatality-free year until 1972. Things were getting so bad that Jochen Rindt became the first ever posthumous F1 champion after a fatal accident at Monza. This was bleak. This was the dark ages of racing. Death was almost an accepted occurrence. It was expected. But one driver disagreed with that. 3-time world champion Jackie Stewart. He had a close call, nearly dying in a fuel-soaked wreck of a race car at Monza, and he swore to improve safety for his sake and his fellow drivers. He organized campaigns to improve crash barriers, and by improve I mean add them. He added runoff areas, marshalling, and basic medical response teams, so that if you did get into an accident, you might not die immediately. And after years of boycotting and years of pushing, and arguably sponsors from Lotus helped this more, because no advertising company wants to see a driver burn to death on live television while their pretty paint job goes up in flames. But finally, he completed his mission and helped safety progressed not just for F1, but across the racing spectrum. Although, it came a little too late for a lot of drivers, as he estimated that 57 deaths were witnessed by him and his other drivers while he was behind the wheel. So, moving on to the 1970s, the 1960s professionalism, the gentlemanlike conduct of the drivers of Sterling Moss, Jackie Stewart, Jim Clark. Yeah, that was replaced with flamboyant hotheadedness of drivers like James Hunt, Emerson Fittipaldi, Jackie Ickx, and Mario Andretti. These guys were very professional, very quick, but they also thought they were the best and they acted like they were. And as a result, rivalries flared up in the masses, particularly between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. While they were friends off the track, heck, they shared a flat together, they were fierce rivals, with the 1976 championship being a particularly dramatic one. Lauda suffering a near career-ending injury only to come back just a few races later, only to lose the championship by one single point in Fuji to Hunt. It was incredibly close, and it wasn't the only thing that was going a bit crazy. Innovation was spiraling, as ideas were left wild. Six-wheeled cars like the Tyrrell T34 or the Brown BT46B fan car, or Lotus with their 79 ground effect racer. Although, that would not be such a good thing. You see, Lotus revolutionized racing with ground effects, undoubtedly, but it also meant that everyone copied them, and that meant as speeds increased, the danger increased once again, and 1982 came to a head with a series of horrific accidents resulting in 2 fatalities and several injuries, some career-ending, and ground effect was once and for all banned from F1, sort of. One thing that did survive the 1970s in the 80s was turbocharging. The first turbocharged F1 car was from Renault in 1979, but it wasn't until 1983 that Nelson Piquet won the championship with Brabham that a turbocharged car actually won the title. And turbocharging is obviously a big effect now, still being used to this day in F1. Another thing that's still being used to this day, carbon fiber. Introduced in a test car for Lotus with the 88, but not being used in F1 until McLaren with the MP4 series. Not the USB or the file. No, that one. There we go. Yep. These things were lighter, they were faster, they were stiffer, and most importantly, they were safer, despite all that. And that's good, because the turbocharging sent power into the astronomical levels. BMW's turbocharged four-cylinder reportedly made 1,400 horsepower in qualifying. And with the cars being so brutally powerful, they're some of the best power-weight ratios ever put in a car. You needed legendary drivers to tame them, and luckily we had plenty. Alain Prost, Nigel Mansell, Ayrton Senna all began racing here. And strangely, Niki Lauda came back out of retirement in 1982, and in 1984, he went head-to-head against eventual four-time champion Prost to the title, where he won by just half a point. Not by being faster, but by strategy. I talked about it in his Niki Lauda video. It was a brilliant nail-biter of a season where strategy beat outright speed. This is also the beginning of what I like to call Formula One dominance. You see, from this point on, Formula One is now known for its dominant teams over the years, starting off with McLaren in 1984, completely swept the title, and that was just the beginning. You see, in 1988, McLaren signed Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost on the same team. Now, Alain Prost was already a runner-up multiple times. In fact, he won the championship in 1985 with McLaren. And Senna, well, I mean, he needs no introduction. At his first ever F1 championship, and his first ever Monaco Grand Prix, and just 4 years earlier, he drove a highly uncompetitive Tolman up to second place in a pouring rain at Monaco, and was catching the great Alain Prost by over 4 seconds a lap. needless to say, McLaren had the two best drivers on the grid as teammates. And wouldn't you know it, they won 15 out of 16 races that season. The MP4-4 they used is the most successful F1 car of all time based on that win percentage. And Senna would come out on top with his first championship out of 3. And the rivalry would continue all the way up to Prost's retirement in 1993. And it was not the Niki Lauda-James Hunt rivalry. This was personal. This was brutal. This was dangerous. It was not a happy-go-lucky one. This was serious. In result, multiple championships were decided by crashes, both drivers getting fined, nearly retiring from the sport out of rage. It was not healthy. But damn was it good racing when it was right. And the cars weren't bad either. Semi-automatic gearboxes, traction control, active suspension were becoming much more common, and audiences could actually see what it was like to drive an F1 car because the cameras got light enough that you could put them on the car without making too much of a fuss for the handling. Now sure, this tech like turbocharging and the electronic aids I just mentioned were eventually banned, but to be honest, F1 was a much different sport by the time the 90s rolled in. Sure, they were less tech-heavy than they were in the 80s, but the cars were even faster, the racing was fantastically close, the drivers were at the top of their game, and well, safety-wise, F1 hadn't had a fatality since 1982. Well, until 1994 at the San Marino Grand Prix. First, Ruben Barrichello was injured in qualifying 1. Then, Roland Ratzenberger died in a crash during qualifying 2 after hitting the wall at over 170 miles an hour. Then, on the first lap, a crash on the start line sent debris into the crowd, injuring 9. Then, a Ferrari mechanic was injured when a loose wheel rolled into the pits and ran him over. And on lap 7, 3-time world champion and humanitarian and representative of Brazil in the international motor racing world, Ayrton Senna flew off the road and hit the wall at 130 miles an hour. The car was safe enough that he would have survived the crash easily if it weren't for the suspension components flying off and hitting him in the head, killing him from massive head trauma. After the San Marino disaster, F1 safety was completely rebuilt from the ground up, and F1 would not have another fatality until 2014. In between those sad, tragic moments, there was a rising phoenix emerging with the name of Michael Schumacher. He started out in a Benetton, winning the championship quite well actually, very good driver, but that was just a warm-up for what was to come. He joined Ferrari and sure enough dominated every single championship from 2000 to 2004, securing him a record up until this moment, this year, because we all know Hamilton's gonna win, 7 titles. Ferrari was so dominant in the early 2000s that people actually started to get frustrated by the monopolization of the podium. You see, we ended the McLaren dominance, and now we're into the Ferrari dominance. It's all coming together now. And there were more problems as well. Formula One at this point may not have been known for fatalities, but it was known for politics. Small teams were leaving the sport, as were engine suppliers, because of ongoing recession from the dot-com crash and the Great Recession. And then we have the IndyGate debacle in 2005 that led to a near riot at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We had McLaren's disqualification for espionage in 2007, which got them a $100 million fine. Renault had their Crashgate scandal in Shanghai that same year, leading to Fernando Alonso nearly being disqualified from the race. And then Hamilton was caught lying to race officials in 2009, and also almost got disqualified from the race. F1's image was being tarnished. It was awful. But out of this pit of political despair rose yet another phoenix in the form of Braun GP. Born out of the ashes of Honda F1, Braun was formed just 23 days before the start of the season with a budget of $2.75 and a second-hand car. And you know what? They won the championship both drivers and manufacturers first try, completely upsetting the established order and putting to shame Ferrari and McLaren. Which brings us on to the 2010s. And a dominant team that got its start in the early 2000s being the only team that was actually able to put a fight up to Braun. And that was Red Bull. And their driver, Sebastian Vettel. Back then, he was unstoppable, and he and Red Bull won the next 4 championships in a row in what's called the Red Bull era. You see, again, the whole eras thing, McLaren, Ferrari, now Red Bull. And so are some other remnants from the early 2000s that came into the 2010s. Well, sort of. The curve system, introduced in 2009, and double diffusers, yeah, those were both gone. And the legendary V10s from the early 2000s were replaced with V8s in the late 2000s, and then, at the end of 2014, they were replaced with hybrid V6 turbos. Because our ultra-fast, completely in-fuel efficient racing series that trots the globe needs to have an eco-friendly mindset. But it is undeniable these are the fastest F1 cars ever made. They make 1,000 horsepower. They pull 6.5 G in the corners thanks to the, well, comical carbon fiber bodywork. Literally every square inch of the vehicle is some form of aerodynamic aid. It's absurd. And they still go over 200 miles an hour. These things are the fastest track racers on the planet. The only thing that's faster accelerating are rallycross cars and dragsters, and even those can't remotely carry the corner speed. They're absurdly fast, but there's a price to that. This thing called wheel-to-wheel racing. First off, they are made entirely of millimeter-thick carbon fiber, that if you breathe on it, it breaks. So it's not exactly going to be touring car style, shall we say. And then we have the issue of aerodynamics. All that aero means the wheel-to-wheel racing is virtually impossible because of dirty air. Now, normally ground effect solves that, but as we saw in the 80s, ground effect is not the best thing in Formula 1. Which means that if you trust the super sleuths of Reddit, yeah, there were approximately 65 on-track overtakes for position that did not have lap traffic, and they were not overtaking people in the pits. And out of those 65 on-track overtakes estimated in 2019, 25 of them were on the straightaways using DRS. The wheel-to-wheel racing isn't so much measured by paint swapping, but by zip code. And then, well, we all know who wins every year for the last 5 years. Ross Braun, famed Braun GP and Ferrari manager, helped Mercedes really adjust perfectly to the turbo hybrid era, and that means they've won the last 7 championships in a row, and Lewis Hamilton has won the exact same. Okay, not officially, but let's be real here, folks. Now, I'm not blaming Mercedes for that. In fact, I don't blame Ferrari for their success, or Red Bull, or McLaren. They're just the best at maximizing the rule set, and there's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, anyway, let's get back on point. Because we have to talk about the future, baby. 2021, hopefully, F1 regulations. These things look actually a lot better than the new ones. The new ones sort of look, the current ones, look sort of, pointy, very much aero-focused. These look a lot smoother, look a lot better in the styling department. More importantly, that reduces dirty air downforce by 30%. And then we have the biggest thing, the budget cap. Currently, F1 does not have a budget cap, per the request of Ferrari, the god of F1 apparently. And they're capping the budget at a measly $175 million. which really puts a problem for Red Bull spending over $200 million, Mercedes spending over $450 million, and Ferrari spending over $500 million a year. Now, how do they do this? By standardizing some parts and limiting R&D. People will say, oh, that's not very good. I think that's brilliant. It doesn't allow every car to be, a exact custom car, but it allows for more competition, cleaner racing, and more racing. And isn't that the whole point of why we go to motorsport right now? Maybe not everyone sees that way. Of course, it doesn't really matter for Ferrari because they can't even win with $500 million, so what are they going to do with $175? Anyway, F1 is a controversial pinnacle of motorsports. It's always been the most popular, it's always been the most expensive, it's always been the most exclusive. And while those don't always contrive to being the pinnacle of something, in fact it rarely does, the fact of the matter is, F1 has given us some of the greatest cars, the best innovations, some of which has even trickled onto the road, like active suspension, traction control. It's very important for just innovation, not just for the racing industry, but for the consumer industry as well. Not many motorsports can say that, if I'm completely honest. And at the same time, it's given us some of our greatest heroes, and sadly taken them away. But while the world is constantly changing, F1, while evolving, is still very much rooted in its history.